So now that we've talked about sort of the evolution of ESG in private markets and what some of the regional nuances have been around ESG across North America, Europe, and Asia Pac, let's talk about talent. How are each of us in our respective regions seeing talent demands in the space play out? Where is the pain point? Where are you finding talent? And what is sort of in demand as it relates to ESG? Alex, why don't you kick off this one?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's been quite a rapid evolution in this time zone, in that until fairly recently, the sort of people coming on board to lead ESG programs often, not always, but often might come from academia, think tanks, development organizations, etc., where they'd have phenomenal credentials in terms of sustainability and all of those things, but might not have so much experience of understanding the underlying business of the commercial entity they were joining. And if we take it to investment managers and private markets managers, particularly on the private market side, often opaque, harder to grasp than listed entities. And so that was often a disconnect. And we've seen many examples of that with very good private equity, private debt, and other private managers who have brought on board very credible individuals in terms of their ESG credentials, but not being so successful with the investment teams or knowing how to really shape a proposition in terms of the factors that are going to make an impact from an investment perspective rather than 20,000 feet strategy. And also understanding what can pass through compliance and risk and legal, etc., from an investment perspective. So there's been quite a shift in terms of, in Europe, in terms of identifying professionals who've got commercial backgrounds. Ideally, if we're talking private markets here, from the landscape of private markets investing, who've gone on to lead successful ESG programs. I think we're also seeing the growth of a kind of embedded versus directive type approach, where those individuals, because they're often more expected to have that commercial nous, should be sat, or part of the team should be sat together with the business and work very closely with them to work out what it is that they're looking to achieve, how, why, whether it's possible, and then to be innovative. And then at the same time, they need to be able to get out and really have strong interface with LPs, prospective LPs, with the borrowers or the portfolio companies as well. So I think we're seeing much more pressure to find rounded individuals who've got commercial experience, ESG leadership credentials, but also great communication skills. And therein lies the challenge.
Well, good luck to you on that. Thomas, are you finding similar themes, or you have some differences in Asia Pac?
Well, I think the core ask of finding an individual who has that rounded commercial understanding and real depth and track record and tenure within ESG and particularly sustainability, and being able to transfer that expertise, but also to then lead the agenda within an organization is really the holy grail, similarly. And those individuals typically, to Alex's point, historically you could have looked at multilaterals and development institutions, but that has in some cases met with mixed results, particularly speaking to the business and really getting ingrained within the commercial culture and strategy of the organization. That we're now seeing a little bit of a shift, both through careful cultural and and deep psychometric and capability vetting, and that eases that passage, I think, for a lot of individuals. Typically also, as I mentioned before, superannuation funds in Australia and New Zealand, more sophisticated LPs, importing talent from Europe in some cases has been the solution. But in terms of the demand, it's really right across the board. So everything from someone who can lead the agenda as head of ESG, straight down to a product specialist, fundraising specialists who can actually work with LPs and articulate the ESG story for a specific fund strategy. What I'm also interested in, and I haven't yet seen it feed through, is what are the implications of ESG, of sustainability, of once there is a coherent reporting framework in place, how does that translate to value creation? Is it aligned with value creation? And what does it mean for individual portfolio companies? And at the portfolio level, how do you look at that? Do you redesign your operating partner network? Do you bring in specialized senior advisors with depth of specialism to add to the management team's capability? So I'm interested to see how the actual activity and the governance associated with portfolio companies will translate to talent demand.
No, that's great. Interesting. And again, similar themes in North America as well. I would say that if we're sticking specifically to private markets firms, there's two things that I'm seeing these firms really try to address. First and foremost is if they don't have somebody really leading the charge in terms of heading up impact, ESG, and or sustainability, that's typically the first order of business, identifying an individual to do that. Most of those hires have come externally from NGOs, think tanks, consultancies, and businesses that are not, they may understand how to work with corporations that are kind of addressing climate, but not necessarily in the context of an investment firm. And so to Alex's point, there's definitely some translation challenges, I think, that have happened in sort of the versions, 1.0, if you will. And I think as people become more savvy, and part of that is, I think, based on how they're onboarded, how they're integrated, and what sort of sponsorship, they have to be able to do their jobs effectively. So we're finding that heads of impact and ESG are not just reporting to sort of an investment person or a business unit, they're actually reporting to the C-suite. They're reporting either to the COO or the CEO in many cases at some of these private markets firms. And the idea behind that is that if you're leading ESG or impact, that there's two prongs that you have in private markets. One is the corporate-wide, enterprise-wide ESG impact work that you're doing as a firm, meaning how does this impact our employees? What sort of messaging do we want to send to the broader communities that we do business in? From a philanthropic perspective, how does that align to sort of our mission as a company? Are we doing the things that we say we're going to be doing? So there's a corporate-wide, enterprise-wide connectivity, and working with external partners and organizations like UNPRI and others, developing, managing those relationships. And then part two is what the two of you have already talked about, which is how does this get deployed in the portfolio companies, and what role do the GPs play in advising portfolio companies in sort of the implementation and manifestation of those initiatives, right? Right now, we're seeing it be more of an advisory role versus anything more concrete yet. And part of that is I think this just continues to evolve. But I think one of the greatest lessons I've learned in doing this work is what I just mentioned earlier, this sort of idea that without the right sponsorship for these roles at these firms, this doesn't work. And what I mean by that is I have seen people come in and try to take more of a bottoms up, tact, if you will, to implementing ESG or integrating it or evangelizing it, both internally and externally. What they find is that maybe there's a pocket of the organization that adopts, but there is no connectivity to the broader enterprise. So it really doesn't really gain any momentum, and it just sort of stagnates. I think what people have learned over time is that you have to have top-down sponsorship in addition to bottom-up implementation and support. And so I think that getting that reporting structure right, getting that sponsorship right, hugely important in doing this work. in addition to the roles that you guys have already talked about?
I think that's absolutely critical. And I think even to take it a level up in terms of the organizational hierarchy, increasingly this needs to be baked into the culture and the mission of the organization. So it's not just superficially greenwashing, that everybody knows and the organization is aligned behind the success of the ESG initiative. And that should be completely transversal, and it should reflect across all levels and all activities of the business. I think once you can generate that mindset, then you're setting someone up for success.
Absolutely.
I think there's also something to add here. The point on the greenwashing, completely agreed. And clearly that's prevalent in all jurisdictions. There are offenders. But equally, there's a lot of brand new converts out there who have suddenly gotten very excited about getting ahead of their competitors in this space, being the most innovative, being the most proactive in this space. And I think there's still, particularly in private markets and parts of the private markets, a sense, with some anyway, that you can bring on board a leader who, with not that much resource, can go about effecting a very wide series of changes across the full ESG, CSR, impact agenda. And I think it does sometimes come as a bit of a surprise to some of the private market participants, what they need to do, not only from a positional perspective, reporting into leadership, et cetera, and having that empowerment, but some of the resourcing that's required in order, particularly from a data perspective, particularly in opaque private markets, to really make this work and to pick the spots that you really want to focus on and make that impact.
Yeah, well said. Before we close out, who would like to make some prediction? Why don't we go around and make some predictions around what we think this is going to look like in the next 5, 10 plus years in terms of talent, in terms of where you see the space moving, whether that be private markets or just generally ESG. Thomas, why don't you kick off your prediction?
I think given the current circumstances, particularly in Eastern Europe, and the energy insecurity, I see energy transition being a huge growth theme. And I think the attention of the world is on it, around energy independence, around renewables, around sustainable infrastructure. And I think that will give it a huge boost to all GPs that are looking at not necessarily energy specific, but everything from renewables through to infrastructure, through to even power storage and effective power storage. From a more direct perspective, I think from a talent perspective, I see the role of the CFO, the portfolio company CFO, changing significantly, because being the custodian of a lot of this data is going to be a significant burden. So whether that means elevating a sustainability role or an ESG role to the ExCo, or empowering the CFO with more strategic, not just reporting and financial discipline responsibility, but an outwardly looking ESG strategy responsibility. I could see that happening. And again, as I say, I'm really interested to see the steps that GPs take to enact their ESG responsibilities or commitments within their portfolio organizations. And how do they go about that? And how do they build the governance framework and the operating partner framework to actually execute, create value, and successfully exit? Because I think we have a challenging period of exits ahead of us, and that will only make non-ESG compliant assets, in some cases, underwater. So very interested to see how it plays out.
Fantastic. Alex?
I just got to say, Thomas, that point on CFOs and the evolution of potentially their roles in terms of ESG, I think is, really interesting, and sort of watch this space. A few predictions of my own. One, leadership model. As we said before, the growth of this kind of embedded rather than directive approach, where the ESG program leaders or product specialists are sat with the business, working together with them to actually work out the art of the possible and translating that into real commercial terms that will drive alpha. To the investment model, so ESG considerations increasingly being part of every investment decision that is made, rather than necessarily being hived off into specialist funds. And that is something which maybe not everyone will adopt, but we're definitely seeing a lot more of that. And it's making the ESG process more mainstream and empowered within private market participants. 3, talent sourcing. We've talked about this. More people, ever more people really coming from commercial backgrounds that are relevant to the underlying businesses that they're going into, be it private equity, private credit, infrastructure, real estate, etc. I think 4th, we're just going to see a continuing push from LPs, investors, and borrowers in terms of reverse inquiry, as they have genuine interest in what's going on in the ESG space, but also are kind of struggling to keep up with the pace of regulatory change, etc. And they will be leaning on private market participants for more support in this context. And then, Paige, I think finally your point about positioning internally. Early on, we certainly saw in this time zone a number of ESG program leaders reporting to the head of marketing or risk management, etc. And that didn't work as effectively as it might have. And I think this push now for ESG program leaders to report either into the chief investment officer, in the case of some of the large integrated firms, or directly into the CEO in some of the independent participants, I think is only going to continue. And that's, again, important to make this work.
Yeah, fantastic. I won't repeat much of what you have said, but I have two kind of thoughts and a wish. The 2 thoughts are that I think the talent, you talk about talent mobility across sectors. I also think talent mobility globally in these roles is going to really increase in pace. And I think in this particular role, more than any other, it is a globalized role. It can be the most, it has the most opportunity to be a truly global role. And I think we'll see some real interesting talent mobility geographically. For that reason, Thomas, you already mentioned seeing Europe to Asia. We see Europe to US, but I think as each of the regions become more sophisticated, we'll see even more of that cross-fertilization globally happening. I also think the role of our sustainability leaders as the potential CEO successors. When you think about talent, why not? I mean, this is becoming such a big part of how firms think, both internally and externally, that I would predict that potentially, bench strength and succession, talent could come from these roles in terms of really leading, elements of the C-suite. Thomas, maybe that's a CFO, maybe that's it could be again a CEO or COO. So I see that leaders in ESG could be that succession plan to leading ultimately these companies. And then finally, my wish is that all of this talk of ESG and defined roles and leaders of specific areas of ESG really kind of gets to a place where it is fully blended. Thomas or Alex, you kind of mentioned this in terms of the investment side of that being more fully blended versus pockets. But I think these titles, these definitions become blended, and it's almost like the air we breathe. We don't really think about it in these compartmental roles, but they become really blended into the requirements of what it means to be a CEO, or what it means to be a CFO, or what it means to be in a leadership position. So ultimately, this all merges and blends together. And as I like to say, we become 3.0 or deep green, fully integrated in everything we do, from investing to running the business. We shall see. Thank you for this incredibly interesting conversation with a discussion on these global nuances and regional nuances. It's been really fun, and we'll have to check in again in another 3 to 4 years or 5 years to find out, did our predictions come true, or is it completely a different world? We shall see.
Shall see. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you.